Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, just last year, we have witnessed amidst the pandemic a worsening crisis across the Southeast Asian region. And when we say crisis, it's not just about health or the pandemic itself, but also the worsening political crisis that definitely needs to be discussed about. And from these discussions, hopefully, we would try to build solidarities across the peoples of this region. And here we have in today's Lawan Podcast people from across the Southeast Asian region to discuss these different issues, to share about the different situations in the countries in the region. So we are your hosts. I'm Monsi with Lawan, or the media platform of the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies Program in Alternative Development, and with me is Ryan.
Hello, I'm also with Mon for Lawan and UP
And we have guest speakers for this afternoon. We have Mimi and Marc.
Hi, I'm Mimi. I'm currently studying at Stanford University, but I'm also an organizer for the current pro-democracy movement from Myanmar in the diaspora community.
I am Mark. I am based in the Philippines, but I'm working with a regional organization working on peace and self-determination issues across Southeast Asia. And in the past weeks, I've been accompanying some fellow activists, provide support for each other, and including for Myanmar, often called as the Milky Alliance. But we could call it however we want to point it. It's more of a support group and solidarity group across emerging movements in the region.
Right, and as Marc has already been opening up to us, we have this solidarity building up among these emergent movements across the region in support of Myanmar. Because as we have seen in the news, as we have heard from our friends in Myanmar, the political crisis there has been worsening. And maybe Mimi could discuss the situation in her country, what's happening there, how is the crisis worsening, and what people are actually doing on the ground to resist the powers that be.
The crisis in Myanmar it has been on the news a lot lately. We've seen a lot of people have been killed in a lot of the pro-democracy movement. So how it started was the Myanmar military, which has been in power for a long time, since around 1962, has come back into the political scene. So in the last decade, so Myanmar has had a military dictatorship for the last 5 decades, but around 2010, the military sort of loosened their tight grip and allow sort of civilian leadership to come to power, and they transform themselves as civilian government, and then they let the pro-democracy groups to come to power in 2015. So we had like around 5 years of a window of freedom. But then on February 1st, 2021, so a few months ago, the military come back to power and assume the iron grip control of the country again. And in response to that, the people who knew how terrible and brutal the military dictatorship has been for years and for generations couldn't accept the fact that the military is now coming back to power. So immediately, it's almost as a reflex, people started resisting and the military, and it comes in so many different forms. The first thing that happened was the people started something called the civil disobedience movement, where the civil servants walk out of their jobs to say that we're not going to work under the illegitimate military government. So in the entire country, the civil servants stop going to work and start striking. And a lot of the unions, student unions, labor unions, come out to the street and to start protesting, to stage street demonstration against the military dictatorship as well. So large uprisings across cities in the country rose up, and for many days, people from all across different stratas of the society, from different groups, different religions, different kind of affiliations, come to join in and resist against the military government, to show that the people don't accept the coup. People are rejecting the coup, and people know that this coup is going to drag the country down into further poverty and further suffering that people are already being put through COVID-19. But in response to the demonstration, the military has been cracking down a lot, and as of today, over 600 people have died. So the Inside, which is a data organization run by the Burmese youth, has set out the statistics that every 80 minutes, one person dies, according to the statistics right now. So you see a really high brutal repression by the government. There has been news of the military using sophisticated weapons like machine guns and hand grenades and heavy weaponry on its own civilians. As we are speaking right now, I'm hearing reports from Bago, which is a division and which is township right beside Yangon, and they are now crackdowns and use of heavy weaponry in Bago right now, and people, we hear that a lot of people are injured and some fatality as well. And yesterday we saw that a lot more people die in Calais, and so these have been happening in a lot of different cities in the region where the military just continue to crack down not only pro-democracy protesters but also innocent civilians. They've been raiding homes to kill civilians. So we are seeing just a fascist armed force just raiding and going into civilian houses and places just because they enjoy cracking down, and they think because they're in power and they see the people as the enemy.
Right, I've been hearing a lot of grave news in Myanmar, especially. I have attended a forum recently that these youth organizers have really attained some level of consciousness that they are willing to take up arms against the fascist junta. For me, it's a sign of bravery, and a disappointment as well in the efforts of the current regime, and how the youth has been seen that only for that these people have been met with violence, and for some, violence has also been a response and a way for them to resist, especially in those ethnic areas. How do you, as a figure in the diaspora movement, see this growing youth uprising?
For a lot, I mean, it's a very heartbreaking situation, right? Especially for those of us who are in the diaspora, because we see that a lot of these things are happening, and we see that a lot of our friends who we went to school together with, who we're staying in school together with, who just happen to go home for the summer, or who just happen to go home for the break, are now trapped in the country and are in this movement. And now a lot of my friends are starting to think of taking up arms or thinking of doing arms struggle against this fascist junta, because frankly, obviously there are so many different ways to fight against the junta, and for some people, armed struggle seems to be their political determination and their political choice, and their choice to make in this time, and especially with a very cowardly response from the international community. It just seems that if they don't protect themselves, they don't protect themselves, and they don't fight for against the junta themselves, there's nobody else who's gonna do it. So that's kind of the conversation that's been going around in this youth struggle. The fact that the military has obviously very sophisticated weapons. It has a large number of troops in the country, and large number of troops who are trained and very well trained to kill with such cruelty and brutality. But at the same time, when your youth who've been having all these dreams about having a good job, a scholarship, and all those dreams just got thrown out the window overnight. And when you see your friends getting killed in front of you, when you see that there isn't that much choice that you're left with, this is armed struggle and just thinking of fighting back against this fascist regime, and that also become an option. And for us in the diaspora, it's really hard to watch, and especially because we're so far away, and it always is feel helpless that all of the things that we're doing are not helping enough, are not enough. And sometimes it's also the fact that you have to worry also about your friends, and then when you see that your friends are going down to training, and then you worry about what is going to happen next, and then the possibility that some of us are never going to see some of our friends again, and that has become a real possibility after so many has died in the struggle already at this point. And so it's a grim situation that we're looking at, no matter whether you're in the country or outside of the country, and especially with the Myanmar military getting emboldened day after day. I mean, the incident that happened in London the other day, where the Myanmar military basically locked out the ambassador, who aren't even all clearly on the side of the people, and that kind of being the impunity, that kind of being emboldened ads are getting increased. So it's almost like even if you're in the diaspora, you're not safe, and at the same time you also worry about your friends and having to think of the options. And it seemed like, especially when the violence increases, it seemed like the future is grim. And so those are kind of the struggles and the emotions and perspective that all of us are dealing with right now.
Thank you, Mimi. So to begin the question, since I've been hearing a lot of grave news, and I'm just filled with optimism of it, seeing a brighter future, that the Myanmar youth see this kind of option as a way to challenge the regime.
It is a very grim situation indeed, right? Especially hearing about what Mimi brought up earlier about statistically every 18 minutes an activist or a civilian died during this siege. But I think it only shows how much the civil society and the grassroots want to seize back that democracy that they were only able to enjoy for a few years. I think this crackdown against progressives is very familiar to countries such as the Philippines in the region, because definitely governments are not afraid to use arms against their own people, against their own neighbors, against the people that they are supposed to serve, right? And it's really frightening that this kind of politics is being exercised in our region.
Yes, and going off to the culture of impunity and the culture of crackdown to activism, and especially in the Philippines. I remember, especially today, it's a holiday in the Philippines. Today we commemorate. It's a day of valor for those who fought the Japanese occupation, who defended and the besieged Bataan and Corridor. And it also echoes now that valor has been, what do you call this? It's been existing in different forms, especially now in the pandemic, that we are seeing new forms of valor, new forms of resistance, especially if our communities are pushed to the brink of survival. Going back to the history, I guess, of our country, the Philippines has been waging a long progressive movement for true democracy in the country. Ever since the people power movement, civil disobedience has also been used by civilians, by political oppositions to overthrow the Marcos dictatorship in the country. But since then, every administration, until now, especially now with Duterte, and in the midst of the pandemic, democracy has been a light in the end of a tunnel for everyone. And due to the culture of impunity, the extrajudicial killings in the country, and now in the pandemic, people are left starving on the streets. People are begging for the government to do something. And I'm reflecting on my friends who I have not seen since the start of the pandemic, who are continuously organizing in communities, in educating grassroots, in mobilizing formations even despite the lockdowns. Ayun, it's a manifestation of how it's a never-ending and ongoing struggle to organize towards democracy, and we are learning a lot from the peoples in Myanmar in their current struggle to regain their political democracy.
Yeah, I feel that with what Ryan has already been bringing up, you would hear organizations, people's movements, grassroots organizations in the Philippines citing Myanmar and drawing inspiration from these people who are engaging in so many forms of resistance, right? A while ago, we heard about the possibility and actually the reality of waging a revolution against the military junta. We also saw, or we also heard about people in diaspora consolidating all of these other groups and individuals from across the globe in order to stand in solidarity with Myanmar. And definitely there are many organizations, formations in the Philippines standing with Myanmar as well. Although I think these people draw their inspiration from Myanmar because we all see the similarities between what's happening. Definitely the crackdowns in Myanmar, which are happening in the public, in the streets, are much worse. No, it's definitely not as comparable to what's happening in the Philippines. But we saw, especially under the pandemic, a spate of attacks against progressives and activists. Only this year, as early as March and February in 2021, the first quarter of 2021, we witnessed, for instance, the infamously called Bloody Sunday in one of the regions in the Philippines, wherein 9 activists who are part of labor unions and farm worker unions have been killed in different provinces in the same region, all in the same day. And besides these 9 who were killed, more activists and human rights defenders in the same region were detained. Also in the same month, we have indigenous peoples in the Visayas being attacked, being killed. The Tumandok people, no, who have been fighting against the construction of dams in their province, have been killed by state forces. So these attacks have a singular objective. They all want to silence these people from speaking up against the different anti-people policies, against these different forms of attacks against our democratic rights during a pandemic. It's as if the pandemic is an excuse for state forces to reestablish their power against the people. Whatever we have started, for example, in the Philippines, our movements definitely have been gaining traction across the board before the pandemic, because we have all been witnessing the failures of the Duterte government in providing basic social services to the masses. And then Myanmar, they have already been enjoying a few years of democracy already. And pandemic comes. And as many scholars and activists have observed, authoritarians have taken this opportunity to be on the rise. No, they have taken the opportunity of lockdowns and the pandemic in general, the immobility of peoples, as a way to secure their power again. No, if not seize power in general. And I think this is not a unique situation in Myanmar and the Philippines. What do you think, Mark, about this? Any thoughts about the region in general?
Yeah, I think we've seen this trend in the past several years, where the first one is, I think there's a noticeable rise in return of authoritarian rule and tyranny across the region, and not just authoritarianism. I think impunity as well, and continuation of disinclusion in many policies. So we've seen that in Myanmar, but we've seen that as well in Cambodia, for example. We've seen that as well in Thailand. I think there are in what we've seen in the past several years is authoritarian government learning from each other. For example, Cambodia's closure of radio stations and independent newspapers in 2018, if you remember that, using issues such as tax rules, you see that the same tactics used in the Philippines when they tried to go after Rappler and also eventually the closure of or refusal of the franchise of ABS-CBN, one of the biggest TV networks in the Philippines last year. And this is something that Singapore, for example, have perfected over the decades. Often I hear, friends from Singapore say that they always hear that when people think about Singapore, they feel like they are out of place because they feel like their issues are less worrisome compared to the rest of the region. But I think in our conversation, it came out that it partly it's true that what's happening in Singapore is less violent and less grave compared to the rest of the region. But often a lot of illiberal practices from even Singapore is being used as a model for many authoritarian governments in the region, because Singapore is thought as to be the most modern, a modern state. So that's why you also see fake laws about fake news being used to justify laws that curtail freedom of expression under the pandemic in Sri Lanka and in many parts of the region as well. But also, aside from learning from each other, they also provide legitimacy to each other. For example, in ASEAN, it's like you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. I will not talk about the issues in your own country, the genocide that's happening in your own country, disinclusion happening in your own country, if you do not speak about mine. Basically, that's the concept of what they call non-interference. So it's a race to the bottom. So it's not really they always say that it's consensus approach, but it's not consensus building. It doesn't supposedly consensus building means that you are creating progressing in creating a norm, which is they always refer that let ASEAN have its own way, of what democracy is. But is really ASEAN developing its own way? Are we really progressing, to somewhere, or are we just really making excuses for authoritarian governments, or making excuses for each other? So there's no consensus building. There's no movement in norms. No one is taking accountability with each other. People are making excuses for each other. For example, you see the calls between of states on Myanmar saying that there's calling for dialogue, as if there's no asymmetry in power between those who people who are being gunned down, political leaders who were detained, the elected leaders who are detained, versus the military who have the monopoly of violence. So we've seen that, but also we've seen in the past several years a renewal of many democracy movements, and it speaks about the history of democracy movements in the region, but also I think a counterculture, or a criticism of the existing movements to the old democracy movement or democracy projects, which is first one that many of for example, under Duterte, we were supposedly after the revolution against Marcos, supposedly in a liberal democracy, but then we returned to an illiberal form of government in tyranny under Duterte. It's also because the first one, the democratization project under post people power, and in my conversation as well with fellow activists in the region is, first one is many of the democratization projects in the capitals, led by old guards in the capitals, by elites and economic and educated elites in the capital, have not first, and also traditional, big NGOs as well, including, I think we need to accept that, first have not resonated to the aspirations of the younger generation. And by younger, I do not refer to it by age, but those who have recently been radicalized and politicized. So I don't want also to say that these movements are purely Gen Z or Gen Y. There are also spans across generations. So it signals a demand for change, even how we envision what democracy is. Where is justice in it? Where is equity? Where is the critique of unjust production, of capitalism in this, of how we treat our workers, but also the colonization even within our own countries. So it hasn't provide democratization projects in the past have not resonated to many marginalized voices, especially rural and ethnic minorities, and for indigenous peoples, for the Bangsamoro, for West Papua, for southern Thailand. And you've seen that in the example of Thailand, for example, the protest last year, when you can see the banners of the self-determination of Patani is related to the democratization, and reform of the government, of the politics of Thailand. You've only seen that recently. You haven't seen that in 10, 20 years ago, being brought in the protest actions in the capitals. So you've seen that, younger emerging movements are also trying to look into how provide space that, we cannot have a democracy where these issues of identities are marginalized and invisibilized. And I think the final thing is there's a project to transcend borders. In any case, the idea of a pan-Asian move or identity is nothing new, but I think it has been evolving currently, given that we have the same enemy, which is, through symbolized by China and the support of China on authoritarian regimes across the region. But also it's the realization, I think, among emerging networks and, the connectivity of democracy movements, because we are more connected to the internet. We are more connected because of even for its failures and its negative impacts, the globalization of, travel and technology was able to connect us with other movements and other ideas across the region. So you see, for example, requests or appeals that from Thailand democracy to reach out to the Milk Tea Alliance or movements in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, Philippines, looking for how Hong Kong or Thailand or Myanmar are doing their protest actions. And so through online means, last year these were limited only to online memes, the rise of the hashtag Milk Tea Alliance. But I think in the past several months, there has been a push, movements in different pockets, not just one pocket of this solidarity movement, to transform this online solidarity movement to concrete support for peer-to-peer learning each other's tactics, but also moral support and also joint action, and figuring out what is that the democracy in one country is not, and also the oppressions in one country is connected to the liberation in another. I think it's a quote that, no one is free until we are all free. And so there's even questions about Milk Tea Alliance before being limited and centered on capitals. Right now you see West Papua rising as well, claiming as well that identity, participating. It's not just national borders; it's even assertions, minority assertions of nationhood. Also, Patani, South Thailand have also linked up with fellows in the movement. So I think there's hope as well, in silver linings, even when we see all this bad news and really abominable developments in the past several years.
Yes. It's great that you emphasize the larger points of this, what do we call alternative regionalism in Southeast Asia, or at least in an ASEAN way. And in response to this, I think we need to build towards a critique against this hegemonic projects such as the ASEAN, who, by its good intentions before it was established, has failed to realize the potential of the region, not the economic potential of. I always hear that ASEAN is an economic powerhouse because it's a huge region for investment, but to realize the various cultures, various identities, ASEAN has failed to take action. ASEAN has failed to take action in the plight of West Papua, the Patani, the Northeast India, the regions that are surrounding even Timor-Leste, to take an example. The region surrounding our region, and building a regional solidarity that transcends borders. And I think from the group that I've attended through, that Marc, Me Me has been organizing, I've seen this space as a way of sharing practices, a way of sharing what works and what not works in the country. Because we don't have to start from the start of the beginning. People have been waging pro-democracy movements since forever. And I think we are ought to learn from one another and ought to fight with one another side by side. What do you think, Mon?
Yeah, definitely. ASEAN as a hegemonic power respects or observes this non-interference principle, which I think is a big hindrance to its purported vision or purported purpose of helping different Southeast Asian countries in the region to develop. In fact, they focus so much on economy, which of course doesn't benefit everyone across the board, that they forget the importance of human rights and definitely the democratic rights of everyone in the region, especially those in the grassroots who are the most in need. And definitely what Mark mentioned or floated earlier about the situation of the peoples in the borders is something that the rest of the people of Southeast Asia must hear, because it must acknowledge the fact that it's not doing good enough for these people in the borders, pushed further into the margins, right? Maybe this is a good point wherein we could discuss these different alliances, the different strategies that we employ, and the different ways that we actually build solidarity, not only across the region but across the globe.
Yeah, I remember hearing from the news something that I think we could jump off a discussion from members of our country, from members of our region who are facing this quote unquote Asian discrimination, especially in the international regions, especially in the United States. What I saw in the news, what I saw in the pictures is that they are uniting in solidarity because of their identities, because they face mutual discrimination. Especially for them, they have long been in diaspora, have long been outside of their country, but are now responding to the emergence in their respective countries. And this tide of hate crimes, tide of discrimination has been a hindrance or a blockade towards realizing our regional strength. I think Mimi could discuss this movement in the diaspora and what have they what have you been achieving thus far? I know you are a busy person, especially recently.
So the diaspora Burmese community sort of immediately came together after hearing the news of the coup, because a lot of the people who are in the diaspora include those people and activists and long time pro-democracy activists who have fled the country after the 1988 revolution. So in terms of the diaspora that is supporting the current pro-democracy movement in Myanmar, the former Free Burma campaigns were sort of that was sort of halted in the past decade. Sort of were revitalized after the news of the coup. So those activists from 1988 in the United States, in South Africa, in Canada, all of them sort of reunite together and starting the week after the coup, they started organizing protests across the United States and around Europe and also around Asia. And so that has been their in-person protests. There have been a lot of efforts to raise awareness about what is going on in Myanmar. And there's also has been a lot of effort for fundraising. So those are sort of the main organizing that are currently happening in support of the movement in Myanmar. And especially the fundraising has been emphasized a lot because of the nature of the movement, because of the CDM. A lot of people are losing their salary and they need a lot of money to support them. So then the fundraising become a huge effort that the diaspora is organizing in terms of with establishing fundraising organizations to support the democracy movement in Myanmar. Currently there are ongoing efforts to do different kind of bazaar and food fairs so that we can utilize a lot of the resources and effort in the Burmese community, Burmese communities in the United States and abroad in general to draw in a lot more international friends to support the cause. So food fair is one of the good way to do. We found that food fair is one of the good way to do it because a lot of the Burmese community want Burmese food. So that if there are a lot of donors, they can raise a lot of money through food fairs. And also the international friends are interested in getting authentic Burmese food, and then that kind of also bring a lot of profit to support that cause. So that has been the recent approach that has started to develop. There has been coordinated global protests that we've been organizing. So the diaspora, the students from Burmese students from all across the world, sort of because we sort of went to school together in Myanmar. Before the coup, when there was a window of freedom within the past decade, and that all of us sort of were given the opportunities and given the chance to go out, study abroad, and explore the larger world that were beyond Myanmar, which was, not even a dream that we could even dream of when I was growing up and going to public school. So when I was growing up, going to public school, going abroad was something that was only limited to a few, very top percent of the society, where you're related to the generals or you're related to the cronies, where your family has a lot of money. But that changed after the transition, where a lot of my friends and, people like myself who went to public school, who come from very humble families, can dream of going abroad with scholarships and, full scholarship that is fully able to support. And so also because we sort of knew each other, it was easier to connect back different Burmese community from all over the world. And then that became sort of the global movement. So we had a global protest on March 27. We're planning to have another one this month. And then we're now starting to get a formal sort of weekly sort of conversation with Men the Diaspora, and talking about how we can support those who are on the ground, how we can be more creative, how we can take this fight to a larger level as diaspora and as a support surrounding those who are actually fighting on the ground. So that has sort of been the effort. And there's also another level of effort in terms of advocacy and lobbying in terms of different governments to push them to take certain actions that to disengage with the Burmese military. So the push has been encouraging, for example, the visa bans for the military officials coming into different countries, cutting ties and pushing for more targeted sanctions for the military generals. So those has been a lot of efforts that the Burmese diaspora has taken. We have also taken tax like trying to get trend on Twitter so that Elon Musk can provide Starlink internet to Myanmar for. So we're basically trying all straws possible. We're trying to catch everything we could possible to support those on the ground. So the diaspora has been just working day and night in terms of finding money and raising money to basically fighting on, starting with Twitter trends to going on virtual protest to just different sort of creative ways to support those who are on the ground. But of course, you also brought up something about AAPI hate and there are increasing hate crimes especially in the West, especially in the United States. And I think that's also a struggle, right, to a lot of our Burmese communities, especially in the United States, because if you're Burmese, especially if you're a woman and Asian living in the United States, definitely a difficult time because of all the hate crimes that has been happening. And it's like very close to you, and especially when you're dealing with the coup. So that's also an added layer. But I think that has also sort of encouraged a lot of us to come together and sort of take the lead role as well in dealing with this, because sometimes the war is really rough and there are a lot of things that are happening, and sometimes you have to take into your own hand to fight for these injustice, and that sort of united and empower a lot of us, while it's also difficult a ground to navigate.
Thank you, Mimi, for sharing what has been the experience of those in peoples in diaspora, especially the Burmese community, who are now waging both their efforts against the coup and also efforts in their own homelands, in a home away from homes. I think Marc could share some final thoughts and some the current efforts of this shared space, this convergent space, and What are the plans, and how do we learn from one another in the region?
Yeah, thanks. Um, well, in the past, I think how many weeks now? I think 8 weeks. Some of us have been gathering regularly to just provide support for each other, but particularly specifically on Myanmar, and use that as a space for us to reimagine, build trust among each other, get to know how we do things, and then find out is what what unites us really, and both in principle level, but also on possessions, on certain things. And while this has just started in the past several weeks, the relationships of many of our movements have been there, both organizationally and individually have been present in the past several years. So even when this so-called Milk Tea Alliance name has only been coined in April last year in response to, to call that a joint counter trolling and against the CCP, the Communist Chinese Communist Party trolls between led by Thailand, Taiwan, and Hong Kong netizens. The movement, the relationship between across this movement have been sustained in the past several years. So and that is, I think, the reason why it's also easy. It's not the ideal, but it's relatively quicker that we were able to gather, pull each other together in one space, because those relationships have been there, built through friendship, but also joint action. For example, I met one of, the initiators of the space was a longtime friend of mine in Myanmar. And I remember that he joined our protest action against the burial of the dictator in the Hero Cemetery in 2017. That was the first time that I met him. He joined this mobilization that me and my group called Black Marcos movement that we started in 2017. And he joined that rally. He asked a common friend brought him to the mass mobilization. And since then we've been friends. We've met each other in particular meetings. We've exchanged notes. And so I think that personal relationship allowed us that, he easily reached out to me. But it wasn't the two of us. It's actually the multiple nodes. I do not see myself or the people in that space as icons. We are nodes basically in the relationships that we have. What we are doing right now is trying to pull all those relationships together, those resources, expertise, inspiration together. And basically that's what the Milk Tea Alliance represents, whatever we call it. And we are just one of the many pockets as well of sustained support, trying to move from online memes to really concrete support and consensus building and joint organizing in across the region. So right now, because of Mimi is part of one of our key focal points, of course, in that space, we've planned a couple of things in the past weeks. We've been able to identify, for example, small things like providing some sort of resources via I wouldn't divulge anymore here because it's of course for security, but some form of resources that we could allow people, friends inside, to communicate, for example, or brainstorm on things that work in our case. For example, how do you communicate in instances when there's no internet? But also pull in our contacts in different UN, ASEAN, and member state agencies to just push certain actors to act on the way that we think is just and right. So I just want to share that for now, today we are releasing our open letter to the United Nations, ASEAN, and member states. It's a collective expression of our frustration of the inaction of the international community, and particularly of specific governments, particularly China and Russia, and some actors here in ASEAN and in the region, particularly Thailand, who have looked away, but not only looked away, but also haven't have opposed even uplifting what the suffering of those inside. For example, Thailand have pushed back refugees across the borders, running away from violence in the ethnic state. So we want to have that collective message that we are fed up. This is the raw emotion of anger, frustration that we have, but also expressing that this is the things that you could specifically, if you really are sincere about the principles that you said you stand up for, both UN and ASEAN. Human rights is in there, right, in their charters. But also it's an expression that even if you do not listen to us, we as members of emerging movements, whether we have been doing this for quite some time, doing organizing in our communities and actions for 5 years, 10 years, or those who have just been recently politicized and radicalized in the past week or month. I mean, it's an expression that in our small ways, we will build the world, the community that we envision, that supposedly the UN and the ASEAN and this member state should claim to say that they are going to, but they for many reasons and their excuses and their inaction, they are not moving. And so we are doing that regardless of our differences, that where we come from, our passports, our nationality, our genders, religion, skin color, the languages that we have. What unites us, I think, is the same struggles, the same aspirations, the same dreams of having a more just society, wherein the economic and political processes and is really by the people, for the people. So that is what the Milk Tea Alliance is, and whatever it is being called right now.
Right. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing all of those updates, and also, I guess it's not just the objectives, but the vision itself of the Milk Tea Alliance, which I think reflects what many emerging movements across Southeast Asia want to accomplish. Yeah, right. And then in this conversation, it was just so interesting. It was so nice listening to all of these ideas and all of these examples from across the globe about the different strategies across Southeast Asia, across movements, across the planet, no, which varies from something as simple as as food drives, to something so radical such as armed resistance, to an alliance built upon social media tactics, no, the Milk Tea Alliance, and all of these different strategies, although varied, all seek to seize back democracy for the people, and this speaks volumes to how the ASEAN failed to serve the peoples of the region. It is not the ASEAN per se that actually unites us, hearing all of these narratives, these experiences. But I guess our continued practice of alternatives, our advocacies, our social movements for rights and democracy, these are the different things that unite our peoples beyond the geographic and political borders set by ASEAN. As we have heard from Mimi, we are reaching the diaspora even, right? The diaspora is playing a big part in uniting the people in the peoples in the region and resisting authoritarianism as it rises in the middle of the pandemic. And I guess from this solidarity or even friendship, as Mark said, our alternative model of regionalism actually emerges, right? An alternative model of regional integration in Southeast Asia that seizes back power to the peoples. And I guess it would be nice to end this conversation with the call to action that we should all build this world.
Thank you, Mon. I think also just to give us some glimpse of what Lawan and what our future content will be, I think Lawan will continue to commit itself in highlighting alternatives, highlighting people's struggle, highlighting people's responses, especially during the pandemic, and hopefully learn more, meet new people, especially Me Me Khant. Me Me Khant will join us from across another time zone from the United States, and hopefully to listen to community organizers who are in the front lines of pro-democracy movements in Burma, Thailand, Northeast India, and all regions, especially and national identities. Thank you, Mimi.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mimi.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.